A wonderful panel of speakers who'll be talking about from recruitment to advancement, how to keep momentum going on diversity and inclusion. As you know, companies made huge commitments to DEI over the last 3 years. Let a lot of employees in Gallup surveys say they are not feeling it in terms of greater respect and sense of belonging. So how can employers, like you all, identify your blind spots and obstacles to progress? How can DEI efforts be implemented during the whole employee life cycle, from recruiting to advancement? And how can managers be trained to become more open in talking about discrimination and its impact on employee well-being? Also, they'll be talking about how to build trust. Moderating this discussion will be Shauna Chen. She is a reporter for Axios San Francisco. She covers race, social justice, politics, and culture, and does some investigative reporting as well. She's got a bachelor's degree in English from Amherst College. So please welcome Shauna and these expert speakers to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I think we've got a great panel for you all to kind of cap off the conference. So before we get started, I'm just going to have each panelist introduce themselves briefly. We can start with Antoinette.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Antoinette Hamilton. I am the Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Lam Research.
Hi, everyone, and I'm a little sick, so forgive me. I'm gonna try to project as much as I can. But I'm Shai Poulard. I am the Head of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NerdWallet.
Hello, everybody. Chad Hugh, Senior VP for Strategy, Equity, and Impact for the YMCA of San Francisco.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meghna Majmudar. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Head of Executive and Leadership Engagement at ReadySet.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sumit Khandelwal. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Zozo Day, a rewards recognition and engagement platform.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit for you all. According to a Gallup poll conducted in spring last year, 84% of chief human resource officers say that their organizations are increasing investment in DEIB initiatives, but only 31% of employees say that their organization is committed to improving racial justice or equity in their workplace. And only 24% of employees say that their company cares about their well-being, while 65% of HR leaders say the same. So that's those are pretty large gaps, especially after the last few years where we've had a lot of companies make very public commitments to diversity and inclusion, especially in the Bay Area. But obviously, it's not as simple as enacting a program or two or doing a training. It's something that has to be ongoing, and that's something that we are talking about today. So I think we'll start with the folks who have a lot of knowledge on what goes into employers, what employers are thinking about when it comes to diversity initiatives. What are some of the things that companies struggle with the most when it comes to DEI, or perhaps overlook, based on your experience, your personal findings, and all that? Meghna, if you want to start?
Sure. It's funny, this is something I talk to a lot of leadership teams about, and I tend to see 3 to 4 things. One is there's a focus on either diversity over everything else or inclusion over everything else, of thinking there's just one number that they need to get to. A second is just thinking about internal stuff, just thinking about hiring only in terms of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and not thinking about what does this mean in terms of our experience, how do we connect with our customers, and so making the connection between the internal and external. How does actually having the diversity in our customer base, how do we need to reflect that in our folks internally? And finally, like I said, people tend to focus on a silver bullet of if we get hiring right, that's it. And that's where all the money went. And I think kind of the extra tip I'll give you is with leaders, they tend to think about they tend to come from more privileged backgrounds, leaders. And so they might not understand that someone who looks different or has a different experience coming up doesn't have the same access to resources. And so leaders may focus on, well, we have this initiative, we're doing so well, we've invested so much. And I remember I had this conversation with a leader and just giving him his very negative responses from employees, and he was really shocked because of how much investment had gone in, but he hadn't really connected to what was important for folks there, in that he was all about a mentoring initiative where there were so many parents in his organization, and they were like, I don't feel I'll get promoted. And so it's that really, what do people care about? And there being some sort of disconnect between leadership and kind of what people are really thinking and are scared to say.
I can go next. In addition to what was shared, what I have noticed is sometimes the approach can be more programmatic instead of strategic. A lot of the times when you look at, and just in my experiences, not necessarily at NerdWallet, but at previous companies, is the approach is always to roll out programs, whether it's a recruiting initiative or employee resource groups. I'm sure all of you work for companies that have employee resource groups, right? Very rarely do you see leaders take it a step further and really understand, well, what does this mean? And how do I regard this as a function? Similar to finance, this is an analogy that I use all the time of finance. Everyone at a company is a steward of finance, right? You own a budget, you're supposed to be efficient, you're supposed to make sure that you're spending in a way that benefits both the internal, organization and consumers. Very rarely do you hear or see finance teams just easily disposed of or even viewed as a programmatic function. It's very much embedded in the organization. And I think that's the missing piece and the disconnect sometimes with DEIB programs is it's viewed as a nice to have or it's viewed as a program as opposed to something that's supposed to be fully integrated and embedded into the organization. So when I'm working with leaders, because I also do consulting on the side, when I ask the question around, well, how does it show up in performance reviews, as an example? How does it show up in product inclusion? How does it show up in the true employee experience? Most of the time, leaders haven't really thought about that because they don't really understand, and everyone's still learning. In order for it to be an effective strategy, it needs to be integrated in the employee life cycle from day one. From onboarding all the way through, someone making a decision to leave the company, they have to feel like they see people that look like them and there's accurate representation. They have to feel included in that sense of belonging and ultimately leading to the ability to thrive. And so I think future state is really thinking through how do we fully integrate it and embed it in our employee life cycle as opposed to being more programmatic.
Yeah. What I would add, so I totally agree with everything that's been said, but another piece that I would add to this really great conversation that I think is timely is actually the connection to the business. I think, more often than not, we don't ask the question, what breaks if we don't do this? And if there's not a good answer to what breaks if we don't do this, then you are setting yourselves up for failure, right? So I think that's what we have to, as practitioners, as organizations, really understand that and connect the dots to what we're doing from the programmatic, from the strategic level. What is it driving for the overall business? Because that's what stakeholders care about.
I think I'm building on that too. Especially on that last point around the focus on why. I think sometimes, whether we're talking about a for-profit business or a nonprofit entity, sometimes right now it's the right thing to do or it's the hip thing to do. The words all sound right, but to my colleagues' examples, the systems and structures may not match the way that the words sound in terms of actions. At the why we try and are aspiring to ground our diversity, equity, inclusion work in our strategic plan and recognize that we have to begin with our employee base, our staff team. And sometimes right now in the very polarized context of our society, there's issues that show up. And so I do think we have to not see DEI or DIB or JDEI as separate from what people are experiencing in their lives. People spend a lot of time at work with all of us. What are the tactical ways that we can create space for all of us to bring our authentic selves, especially and even when it's messy and when it's conflictory and when it's challenging.
No, totally with you, and I think you brought the right point, which is about the why. And a lot of times when we speak about diversity, it generally gets into a more about a good thing to be done than really about actually making it inclusive. So if the strategy which was mentioned, if the strategy has diversity as one of its, the outcome of this, how does it lead to building a culture of innovation? That's something which has to come up, and then it goes back to defining it in terms of specifics to what the management can do and how it can go downstream to ensure that this is a part and parcel of everybody's life. It should not happen that I just have a number of diversity, but at a day-to-day level, when I'm actually doing a leadership hiring, a leadership promotion, we really don't think about it or really don't care about it. So it just doesn't, I think rightly mentioned in terms of the question about, it's just not about another number to be, but also about understanding that this would help in driving a core business growth for the company, driving a key strategy for the company, and also making employees a lot more owned or having a lot of relationship with the organization than just saying, hey, we have matched the numbers of diversity.
Yeah, I'm definitely hearing a lot of threads there that probably could be a panel of their own, honestly. But I think one of the things I want to talk about next is really, you all kind of spoke about the importance of being holistic in your approach to DEI, whether you're a company or you're just, a manager or an employer. So, we've got a couple companies represented up here. We've got a couple, more new kind of startup companies, and then we've got the Y, which is an institution that's been around for a long time. So how do you actually make all of that work? What we just talked about, or what you all just talked about, in the everyday aspect of organizations, especially when the challenges are kind of different, right? I'm imagining that with a startup company, very different from something that's been around for a while.
Yeah, so I could go start with it. So relatively a startup in that sense, with almost 400 odd folks across different parts of the world. So it becomes something which is not one of the mainstream items for us to think about. And when you start looking at adding people, when you start looking at building teams, what generally starts coming out is that you see that there's a certain skew of a certain of a male versus female, certain regions, certain religion, all of those coming in. And then somewhere down the stream, when you keep growing, you understand that, hey, you're really not thought about it, right? You've not been able to bring in a lot of people in your leadership who are women who are handling key roles. And then you go back to your drawing board and you start thinking that how can you build that? Because the organization can grow if you have the right mix of talent, and people would love to join the organization if the mix is right. So when you start looking up it, and then the second anecdote on that is that when you start hiring people across different geography, today we have people in more than 15 countries. When you start hiring people over there, it becomes very inherent that the managers or the leaders really understand the culture of different countries. It should not happen that you start expecting that the way you have been doing things is the same way that people will have to do things from the other countries as well. So that is something which again becomes critical for you to do as you keep growing. And then is when you start realizing that, hey, this is something which should be a part of just not about building it as a culture, but also a part of your hiring process. Because when you hire the right talent, they would appreciate and respect that as a part of your thesis. So the last point on that, I think a lot of what we need to do today as an organization is to sell to companies globally. And then when you sell to customers globally, there's a lot of buyers who are of different culture. You don't understand the way you have to sell to them. You don't understand about how you have to speak to them. And then it again comes in that this is very important for all of us, just not to speak about it, but also imbibe it, respect it, and read a lot about it so that you start respecting each of them as individuals and start embracing that and start making it as a part of your own organization culture as well as when you reach out to your customers.
Yeah, I think what I have seen make a real difference is the specificity of behavior. A lot of people don't know, what does it mean? And like, it is so subtle. Like I remember there was this one client, leader of an organization where he picked up on a comment in a chat in Zoom. And that spoke volumes. And so just training people and managers to say, make sure you're checking in on the chat. And then bringing people into the conversation. So specific behaviors are really important here. A lot of managers struggle with well, I don't want to come across as racist, and because this person's so different. And I know there were many clients at a financial services firm where they didn't want to give feedback to women because they're like, but what if she cries? And I'm like, what if she cries?
Wow.
And so what if she cries? But feedback is so important to her getting better at her job. And if you're thinking about her crying and you're focused on your own comfort,
Exactly.
if you're focused on your own comfort, you're not helping her be better at her job.
Right.
And that's the level of you can be specific and, especially as HR leaders, just that coaching you can do where someone vulnerably asking, what if she cries? It's okay. You're helping her get better at her job. And if she can feel that, she's not gonna cry. She's actually gonna get better at her job.
And I would say yes, because we all know men cry too, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
So when I think about what we can do, I think we have to go back to really what inclusion and diversity or DEIB or IDIA, whatever term we're using within our organization. At its core, inclusion and diversity is a change management initiative. And think about, how do we impact and affect change within organizations? And you do that through stakeholders, right? So again, I think so oftentimes this work is centered in HR, but the implications are so much broader. So therefore you have to get influencers outside of your immediate scope. So you also have to be a salesperson. I was on a call this morning and again, it was with business leaders and we were talking about this thing we were filling out and someone was like, well, why don't we have more women? I was like, well, let me not miss the point of an ask, how we can affect and impact this number is we have 13 leaders on this call. The next time you have an open rec, please make sure you're asking for a diverse slate, right? So using those opportunities to insert your influence to be able to use the influence of others, I think is a key way to ensure that this work has momentum, but also is going to move the needle because again, 1, 2, 3, or even HR teams of 400 are not going to be able to affect the work that needs to happen around inclusion and diversity because the topic is too big.
Mm-hmm. In addition to that, I'll add that you want to emphasize as much as you can that DIB is a co-op, and how to do that is you systematize as much as you can. So something we're really thoughtful and intentional at NerdWallet is, back to my earlier point around embedding it in our employee lifecycle, we noticed that there sometimes is some resistance to participation when you even use the words DEIB, right? Because if it's someone that doesn't want to say the wrong thing or doesn't want to engage, they may avoid altogether. And so we have this inclusion scale. We're like, where are you? Are you including? Are you avoiding, right? And so what we have started doing is we have started just integrating these concepts in some of our other forms of training. So we're rolling out a manager foundations training. So instead of saying we're rolling out inclusive management training, it's expected at NerdWallet that you are an inclusive manager, right? So you're going to join this management training, and that's going to be embedded in the training so you don't feel like, oh, now I'm having to attend this inclusive leadership, inclusive management training. I'm attending management training at NerdWallet, and that's what's expected of me. We've also started emphasizing allyship, and what does allyship mean to the organization, both internally and also to our external stakeholders, and helping our nerds really identify what their path of allyship is as an IC, as a leader, as a manager, emphasizing that allyship is a verb, it's not a noun. right? You can't call yourself an ally. Someone has to see your daily behaviors and identify you as an ally. But what are some behaviors that you can start practicing to communicate and demonstrate that? And what we've noticed is people that were kind of afraid of the conversation are now engaging more because it doesn't feel like they're being put on the spot or they have to have the right answers. We're like, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Change is over time, and as in this space, you're gonna make missteps. So let's just throw it out the window. There's no cheat sheet, there's no steady guide. You are going to make missteps in interacting with humans, and so let's get comfortable making those mistakes, fail fast, learn faster. And we found by just implementing some of those pieces, we've seen a change in engagement and people wanting to actually drive the conversation.
I love that, DEI being a co-op. And I think too, right, I mean, across sectors, as we grow in our roles and as we grow in our companies, we are benefiting from the system in the way that it is, including us. And so if we are looking at a holistic approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, the question has to be posed, who is not gaining from the system the way that it is? It's not an easy question, and that's why we're struggling with this, to be transparent. And how do we then, to a co-op model, sort of turn over power through accountability to the people that we're here to serve, which we serve our employees, at the why our employees then serve our community. Are we willing to actually look the counterintuitive way of where power exists? Who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to the CEO? Or are we accountable to our employees? Are we courageous enough to really have that dialogue? And then from a holistic context, right now the world is on fire. Every one of our dimensions of diversity is on fire. There's not a single day that goes by or an hour that goes by where some aspect of who we are doesn't feel like it's under attack, regardless of where we may fall on the socio-political spectrum. That's the reality that we all and our employees are bringing to the workplace. So how do we, from a holistic lens, create space that acknowledges that? Not says, leave yourself at the door, come do the thing at work. Oh, and by the way, here's a DEI program. Come join an employee resource group. Take this culture survey. Nah, it don't work that way.
Right.
So holistic in the context of a real co-op approach.
Right. Yeah, I think that brings me to my next question. I think you talked about, Chad, who systems are benefiting. And I think a lot of times for people who are in marginalized communities, the assumption is that the company or the institution is not actually for them. That they are, even if they are inside of it, that they are treated differently or that they're not going to benefit in the same way. That's kind of the baseline assumption. And actually the polling from Pew has also shown that to be the case. So how do you actually, meaningfully engage those folks who are, for good reason, right, distrustful, worry, and are just kind of like, well, I'm just gonna do my work and leave it at that and not expect more.
So on that specific note, I think the most important part of it is, rightly said, is to identify that this is happening. And what companies do is, you actually invest in some tools and softwares. I think you mentioned about these culture surveys. And what's critical over there is to just not have surveys which is holistic for the entire organization, because what would happen as an outcome is the outliers, which are already small, will not really get captured in the survey. So it's best to kind of have surveys for specific close groups or have some specific group discussion FGDs, which generally gets you or gives you a sense about what's exactly happening. Because that is most important first, is to identify that this is actually happening and people are disengaged. The second thing which organizations should do is, beyond using a tool to capture the survey or the feedback, is to invest in softwares where they make it simple for people to communicate across, right? I think communication channels are really important because people find that, and more so when people are working from home at different places, different locations, different geo, a common good communication channel really helps you bring all the employees in the same page. And last but not the least, what I think is running a lot of investing in appreciation or recognition for people to take act or do a behavior change would help. So what I mean by that is to have something as a part of a value system that, hey, you get a recognition for showcasing that you are empowering folks around. You get a recognition for respecting people for what they are. I think that if you build in as a part of your organization culture, use tools for measuring that, and then implement that in the ground, that's probably one of the better ways to kind of solve for and make people more employees to just not come in and do your task, but essentially give your best and improve the productivity overall for the organization.
I would say what not to do is let's not burden those people with the work.
Yes.
So let's not do that. But I think one thing we can do is focus on symbols and signals. And those symbols and signals are going to look differently across the organization. So make sure that you're building the processes. We've said some of this, but you're building those processes and symbols into the way your organization is led. So an example of that, I think that is super simple, our team's backgrounds, right? Again, it feels like every other week, but definitely every month, there is a holiday, right? Like how do you incorporate and signify that it's okay to celebrate culture within your organization? Simple way is through a background. A better way is to have, someone who is the leader of 100 people have that background on when they're presenting. I got a nice note from someone that said, hey, my leader had a pride background on. I felt included, right? I think some other things is when you're having all employee meetings, right? Again, taking those key activities that you're driving from an initiative standpoint and making sure they have a main stage, that the voices talking about inclusion and diversity are diverse. And when I say diverse, I mean from a hierarchy standpoint. Can't be the inclusion and diversity person, only talking about inclusion, about these topics. It can't be only HR. It has to be from all leaders within the organization. So to that end, we actually did something that was super, super significant within our products group. We actually just had open door talks, and we had a topic. We didn't have any slides, and we prepped the leaders. I was there, some other folks was there, and we just had open dialogues around what people wanted to talk about. 500 people showed up the first time, 1,000 people showed up the next time. We had not one slide, but it was important because they felt that they could come and have a conversation with this leader who was an icon in the organization, talking about a topic that he cared about, but it was a recent care, and he actually even said that and was authentic in that. So I was to say those were our signals and symbols. Your organization will have their own, so look for those signals and symbols where you can insert this work into it so that those people who maybe are not voicing up knows that it's okay now to voice up.
Mm-hmm. I would also add lean into the unsaid and the unnoticed. And what I mean by that is what I've experienced is engagement surveys say one thing, right? But then participation, engagement says another thing, right? And so when I notice that there are a lot of performance issues, and as an example with a specific group, or there's a lack of participation in things that we're rolling out that I know specific groups want and they voice that they want, I kind of lean in beyond the engagement survey. So employee resource groups could be a really powerful lever here if you have that in your organization. And I say proceed with caution, because I actually did this week where I'm a big advocate of asking very powerful, open-ended questions, but like in a facilitation style, right? Like almost leading the witness. And the question that we posed this week was, how can your manager serve as a better ally to you? And when I tell you the things that came up in this conversation, tears, there were tears in this conversation, right? As a result of this conversation, there was a lot of vague statements, which I'm sure any of you that have rolled out an engagement survey, when you look at the comments sometimes, you're like, okay, that's great, but what am I supposed to do with this? This is not giving me, anything that I can actually action on. So it was an opportunity for me to lean in and ask those follow-up questions and really understand, is this an overall experience theme? Is this a you theme? And redirecting people to the right resources. Sometimes we can have the most, strategic and effective organizational DEIB strategies, but the team experience is very different because of an effective manager, right? So really being able to diagnose where are the pain points, what is causing the disengagement or this inherent belief that this is not a space for me, so I'm just gonna do my work and go home, and create tangible solutions to that. And I think something that I'm gonna hold myself accountable that I can do better and my colleagues in this space can do better is when we action, remembering to actually call it out. you said this, as a result, we rolled out, this initiative. We want your feedback. Let us know, did we hit the mark? Did we miss the mark? But sometimes we hear the problems, and as action-oriented people, we roll out solutions, but sometimes they're not the best solutions. So my mic is about to fall. Just remembering to call out that some of these initiatives and strategies and programs are as a result of what we heard. And if we missed the mark, let us know. So.
I think too, so representational diversity is important. And I love what you said around allyship being an active verb, right? I think the question is for all of us, once we get to a point where we do get to set the tone of what others that follow in our shoes have to do, what courage do we have to change the game? Or do we say, I survived,
right.
I got here, now you do it too?
Right.
Or do we change it? That can be something as simple as how we dress. For me, it's having tattoos, it's my mandals, if I can draw attention to that, sorry. I don't fit the mold of what an executive should look like at The Wire and other companies, right? But this is my way of saying, I got here, I'm trying to be my authentic self, please feel empowered to do the same. And our CEO, Jamie, who's the first openly gay male to ever lead a Y in the whole country, we're a little bit behind in the Y, he has set that tone. Right? And we're trying to do this at every level. I have colleagues in the room, Laura and Suzanne, who are striving to embody this, that call us, call me, call we together in on ensuring that once we get to the table, that's the easy thing. Mm-hmm. What do we do? Do we lean in and have the tough conversations? Do we call our colleagues in or out? Do we person up and have those tough conversations? Do we talk around the thing, or do we hit the nail on the head, even and especially when we risk something?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing in all three of your comments is there's a real humanity of really letting the humanity of whatever is showing up. And I think, Shauna, why do people get disengaged is because they don't feel seen as a human. And so to the extent a leader can come across as human, you can humanize managers, you actually listen. Absolutely. And you humanized yourself. That's really important. And people start to understand the why. Yeah. People give up when they don't feel like they understand, but they know how to not bring attention to themselves.
Yes.
And so they'll just do whatever's needed. But if they understand the why and they have you can figure this out yourself, and I'm working with other humans, then they'll be willing to move and try.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard, right? I think every person is different. Every person has their own, challenges and difficulties, and all of that does get, brought into the workplace, whether intentionally or not. One of the statistics I read earlier was about belonging and the huge gap between, what HR leaders are saying about how they think their employees, feel in terms of belonging versus employees. That was a complicated sentence, but yes, there is a gap, basically. So, actually, belonging is really difficult. It's one of those kind of nebulous terms, right? You can't. Everybody has different ideas of what that actually means. And when you're, leading a company or even just working in one, it's difficult to even have it at the back of your head every day when you're doing your work. So how do you all, approach that? And what do you think actually needs to happen to bring that, gap, or narrow that gap, perhaps?
Okay, everyone's looking at me. I will just say, the reason I was pausing is I think we've given some good, examples of what that looked like. Again, I would say symbols and signals again, right? When I look at your beautiful skin, that's what I see. It's okay for me to do that. This idea of belonging, if I think about it another beat, one of the things I would say is that we have to think about what belonging means outside the U.S. context.
Yeah.
Many of us are operating in areas outside of the U.S., and I think those signals and symbols on belonging are often ones that are seen as U.S. symbols. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. When we're on a Zoom call, sometimes my colleagues who are in other countries are very silent. Again, that moment, somewhere else, would have been a disaster. We would have been all sitting here looking at one another. As an American, I know, I've been called on. I got to say something, but our colleagues in other countries may not do that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think when I think about belonging, it's understanding and recognizing that looks different other places. And then my job as a leader is to be able to articulate and voice up for that.
I also see belonging as an output of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So,
Good job.
right? It's even at NerdWallet, we say DIB, but to me, it's like it's if we're really focusing on increasing representation and making sure our internal representation matches the consumers that we serve. We have inclusive practices. We are being equitable in our approach. Then, ideally, everyone should feel that sense of belonging. And I think one of the under-leveraged pieces of the equation, if you want to call it an equation, is the equity piece, right? So Antoinette spoke on that perfectly, right? Of like there is a US-centric way of operating, and then there's a global way of operating. And so inclusion is great, but inclusion means nothing without equity, where we're really meeting our employees, our colleagues, our consumers where they are, and building with that nuance in mind. And one of my mottos is, if we build with the person with the most need in mind, everyone wins up the chain, right? And so that's what I would say belonging is, personally to me, I'm not gonna speak for the organization, I'll say personally to me, belonging and what it looks like in its most truest form and in its most successful state is that we're really focusing on the equity piece of DEI and really figuring out how do we build in a way that everyone wins, thus leading to that sense of belonging.
I really agree with that. Belonging comes out of it. And I think you're calling out, well, HR leaders think X, but people in organizations think Y. And I'm like, that's just the data. We're actually not doing belonging well. We're not putting the things we need to put in place for belonging to emerge. So I really love kind of what's coming out from those comments of, like, what if, like, we're just like, okay, we need to do better, and how do we get creative now?
And I think too, building on that, I love the symbols and signals. I think I would encourage us and anyone to first define belonging and then decide who gets to measure that. We can't tell someone, hey, you belong now, welcome. You might say, okay, great. No, I don't. Right? Symbols and signals. I mean, the first time I saw our CEO with his husband on a video, that signal was damn clear. It's a part of why I came to work here. Makes me feel like I can see myself with my husband one day, something that was not possible in my own mind, right? And when we think about the context of belonging, there's also different tiers to it. Someone can belong in a company, but not feel like they belong on their team. Someone can belong in an organization, but not feel like they could belong in leadership. Someone could belong in leadership, but not feel like they can open their mouth and speak because of whatever the dynamics are. There's different tiers to that. And if belonging is a thing, and I agree completely it's an output, then not only who measures it and who defines it, how are people held accountable? Where I would love, I'm gonna get myself in trouble at the Y, for us as leadership to be held accountable to whether or not employees feel like they belong in our organization. Yeah, we gotta meet the budget, yes. Yes, we need to raise money, yes. Yes, we need to get more members, and yes, we need to redefine this and that. And how do we make sure that every human who walks through the door of a YMCA, as a staff, as an employee, as a member, as a volunteer, as a young person, where if any of you are welcome to, do you feel like you belong? Do you feel welcome? That would be powerful.
Right. Yeah.
And very powerfully spoken. No, very well said. And I think just to kind of, it cannot be a place where that's something which you speak about once in a while. It has to become the DNA of the organization. And when I speak about the DNA of the organization, it should start with the leader or the management speaking about rewriting the job description right from the hiring process, saying that, is that a part of my hiring process? Is this a part of my benefits program? Does the benefits program take care of everything which is to take care of diversity in that? So it has to be that every part of the organization culture, every pieces of HR policies has to have diversity as a part of it, because then it would become a part of the DNA. And it's only then that the people or the employees who are joining in would really believe that it's inclusive. It's just not about another number to have. And assuming that would help you solve the divide between what is actually spoken about and what is actually happening in ground.
Yeah, I guess we'll see in a few years, maybe. Okay, we have a couple minutes left. Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground here. I want to ask our panelists if you all have any final comments for folks here who are, working in the space or want to be able to contribute.
I'll start. Again, for my final comment, I thought about this a lot. And again, especially here, I think in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, we talk a lot about accountability. And I think for me, like what would create momentum to keep this work going, and someone said it earlier, but I think we have to move from accountability to we need to move from accountability to consequential accountability, right? Like what's gonna happen, what's gonna break if we don't get this right, and then who are we gonna hold accountable, and how are we gonna hold those people accountable in a way that doesn't cancel them, right, but actually empowers them and inspires them to do more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I'll speak from a different lens, and this is something that I don't think we talk about enough. This work is not easy. Mm-hmm. It's not. It requires a lot of emotional uncentering. It requires, us, and not just DEI, any HR function, right? It requires you to give a lot of yourself. And so, final thoughts is, don't feel like you're on an island on your own, which in this space, it can definitely feel that way. You're in a room full of people that are passionate and are driving this work, right? So lean on your village, lean on your tribe. Don't feel like you always have to reinvent the wheel. Pooh, I learned so many gems and insights just being on this panel. So I would say, it's okay to be exhausted. As was mentioned, we're fighting a lot of battles and there's a lot under fire right now. So it's okay to be exhausted, but just always remember the end result and remember that you catch more flies with honey. And so sometimes in this space, the emotional uncentering also means you got to meet people where they are. And sometimes you have to give a little to get a lot. So I do want to acknowledge that in this space.
And to build on that, I think become more comfortable being uncomfortable and be comfortable with being more authentic in spaces where we may not feel authentically that safe, and surround ourselves with different perspectives, right? I think a lot of times we do put walls up to do this work. And the affirmation comes from outside. My challenge to myself and to us is let's get our affirmation from inside. In this work, someone will always have an opinion. The shiny person always gets smacked around. How do we affirm ourselves? Even if we get beat up, even if we may have our own supervisor say certain things that might not align with how we think we perform, but we know what we did. We know the space we created. We know the battles we fought to just show up at work that day. We know.
Yeah, and I think we're now entering the most interesting time in this conversation. Before, it was so much on the interpersonal and what's happening here, and now we get to really do the systemic change. And that means we need to all be together. And so, how to keep the momentum going is actually to broaden our view of this is beyond the interpersonal and into the systemic. We are asking fundamental questions about how we structure work and our societies now. And so that's very exciting.
Absolutely.
For me, I think there's a lot of learning for me in this process to implement in our organization itself. So I will probably take that and implement that as a part of the closure statement.
Thank you. Well, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here.